Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security here, which houses the Cyber Statecraft initiative, which was the arm that was working on this project. This morning's event will be a moderated discussion on the security risks as well as new opportunities that networked medical devices offer society and various users. As part of today's event, the Cyber Statecraft Initiative, working with Intel Security, is publishing a new report on the topic, and I assume many of you saw it on the way in. It looks like this. We certainly welcome your thoughts of it. The report's authored by Jason Healy, who's the director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative here, as well as Neil Pollard and Bo Woods, and it draws attention to the delicate balance between the promise of new technologies, such as networked medical devices, but also society's ability to secure the technological and communications foundations of these devices. This is one particular manifestation, healthcare, but there are going to be many others as technology further develops. The medical industry itself has been rapidly evolving over the past few years, creating new technologies that can unlock vast new benefits for patients, for other users, and broader society. These new technologies hold the promise of improving healthcare outcomes and the quality of life, empowering patients, cutting skyrocketing healthcare costs over time. But the rewards of networked healthcare come with some obstacles as well, in particular, as we're discussing today, to ensuring their security for patients and the broader population. Today's report is the second in a series examining the potential of key technologies, as well as the importance of getting security right in order to unlock the true potential of these technologies. The report analyzes the risks and rewards related to networked healthcare devices and provides specific recommendations and guideposts to help foster innovation while minimizing these security risks. The report finds that a key tool for overcoming the security risks is building security into devices from the outset, something we've heard in other areas as well, and not as an afterthought. Also, deepening the private and public-private collaboration is critical, as well as offering a voice in the debate about these devices to the public. This is, in our view, the best way to ensure balance among effectiveness, usability, and trust when devices such as the ones discussed here are implemented and operated. Today's event is part of the larger Cyber Risk Wednesday series, which is our monthly speaker series designed to bring cyber experts from government and industry together to examine topics at the core of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative's mission. This event comes at a special time, too, for the Council. Just yesterday, in this space, in the broader space next door, we announced the winner of our first competition on the Art of Future Warfare project. This was a months-long crowdsourced competition, and the winner wrote that the next war will start with hacking the pacemaker of President Putin in 2019. And we're not making any political suggestions here about that. But it is something that shows that this is an increasing concern across a broader community than the specialist community, much of which is represented here today, but it's a broader community of interest, and then hopefully a broader community of influence as well. So with us this morning, we have a really distinguished panel and group of experts, all well-versed in the nuances of the challenges and potential of networked healthcare devices. We're particularly pleased to have Representative Diane DeGette to deliver keynote remarks today. She is serving her 10th term in Congress as a representative for the 1st District of Colorado, while also serving as Chief Deputy Whip of the House Democratic Leadership, as a member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, an exclusive congressional committee with vast jurisdiction over healthcare, trade, business, technology, food safety, and consumer protection. She is one of the real leading voices in the healthcare debate in this country. She's used her position to improve quality and access to healthcare and played a key role in the drafting and passage of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which was signed into law, as most of you know, by President Obama in 2010. She also led the overhaul of the U.S. food safety system. Representative DeGette has also become one of Congress's leading experts on cutting-edge scientific research, and she's a recognized leader on the subject of human embryonic stem cell research. As the Democratic leader of the bipartisan 21st Century Cures initiative, she is working to make medical research discoveries in the lab into treatments and cures for patients. Her leadership on the issues of healthcare and innovation, therefore, uniquely position her to discuss the opportunities and challenges of networked medical devices. So not surprisingly, we're very excited to hear from her today and look forward to the discussion that her remarks will stimulate as we work towards a better understanding of the potential of the healthcare Internet of Things. Before I invite her onto the stage, though, I'd like to also briefly introduce Mr. Pat Calhoun, who will also be giving his remarks before we kick off the panel discussion. Mr. Calhoun is the Senior Vice President and General Manager at McAfee's Network Security business. He leads the engineering, marketing, and sales functions that drive worldwide growth for this area of the business. Before joining McAfee, he was most recently at Cisco, where he led the Secure Network Services business unit and was responsible for strategic direction and market success across a broad portfolio of products generating more than $1 billion in revenue. While at Cisco, he also served as Chief Technology Officer for wireless networking and access network and services. He's held a variety of equally impressive positions before that, but obviously with this resume, extremely well qualified to discuss the issues we're addressing today. So I'm now going to get off the floor and turn the floor over to Representative DeGette. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Barry, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you for having me here today. I'm really happy to take part in this forward-looking conversation that can help us think about rapidly emerging and changing events in healthcare. We've been having conversations over in Congress for years and even decades about the Internet's role in changing various industries, personal habits, and our way of life. So today's conversation and the whole series that the Atlantic Council is hosting show that the discussion is much more practical and specific now as we move towards thinking about the way we're restructuring healthcare in this country. If you think about it, this was once a future trend to forecast and imagine how it would work for patients. But today, we're seeing technology applied to healthcare in some exciting new ways. First of all, I want to give you an example, kind of a benign example. My congressional colleague and friend from Colorado, Ed Perlmutter, has become the most dedicated Fitbit user you could ever imagine. Ed has his Fitbit. I believe that he gets a commission from the company every time a new member of Congress gets one, because he's got about half of the U.S. Congress bipartisan on the Fitbit. And he uses the technology to constantly track his activity wherever he goes. Sometimes I'm at Denver International Airport and I see Ed pacing around the concourses so he can get his extra steps in that way. I want to tell you a second example, well, of course, staying fit is serious, but something that's more personal and even more serious to me, and that's my 21-year-old daughter, who has been a type 1 diabetic since she was 4 years old. Francesca has an insulin pump and a continuous glucose monitor, which help her keep her blood sugars, even though she's a college junior, under control all of the time. And the way it works, if you don't know, is the pump acts as a receptor for radio signals that come from the continuous glucose monitor, measuring her blood sugars every few seconds. And then the data that the pump collects is transmitted to a computer where her doctor is able to slice and dice that data and help program the pump how to deliver the insulin to Francesca in accordance with her biorhythms. It's a medical breakthrough that is going to save the lives of Francesca and millions of other diabetic patients around the world. So technologies like the Fitbit, like the continuous glucose monitor and insulin pump, are impressive steps from the pedometers and other devices that we were using previously. But the cutting edge of healthcare Internet of Things promises to do much more. As both medical and internet technologies reach a wearable size, Even more innovations will soon provide patients and their doctors with information and insights that were completely unavailable before. And some of the technologies we talk about, of course, are implantable technologies and so many others. We will gain insights into how a medical condition affects each patient in real time. And it gives the doctor a chance to monitor changes much more precisely and with much more comprehensive understanding. This level of detailed information will then be able to help us treat patients on an individual basis and even to cure them. So, with this change underway, policymakers need to encourage innovation and keep patients at the center of everything we do. As these new internet-powered health devices give us more powerful information, we will face much more serious patient protection and privacy issues. And let me just give you a couple of examples. Ed Perlmutter with his Fitbit. If someone could get in there and get that data, you could see how that could become an issue on the internet and a real privacy issue for him. But even more seriously, with devices like Francesca has, not only would we risk a breach of her privacy and her data coming out, potentially, though, with intentional disruption, we could even reach the issue of serious physical injury or death in patients. And this could be a new wave of terrorism that we see. Now, I would argue that the privacy issues that we're facing right now is kind of a good problem to have. It has two edges, but it's a good problem to have because what it means is that we're dealing with real advances for patients and medical providers. But nonetheless, it's a challenge for us to ensure that new developments adhere to core standards. Patient safety and efficacy gain additional meaning when you're talking about an online context. And so we're going to have to apply those protections in new ways. Last Congress, I supported the Software Act, which is sponsored by Gene Green and several of my Republican colleagues, which seeks to clarify FDA's ability to regulate those new technologies. The feedback generated by the Software Act's introduction has been very helpful and constructive to helping add clarity to these issues. And as both the House and the Senate look at ways to strengthen and modernize some FDA activities, we have to be sure that the agency is equipped and ready to address this new responsibility. The precise shape of any legislative direction to these issues remains an open question. As you may know, Congressman Fred Upton, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I are working very, very hard on drafting a legislative product for our 21st Century Cures initiative. Our staffs are working together assiduously every day, and they're working with both not just in a bipartisan way in the House, but also with Senate colleagues and with colleagues from the administration. All of our discussions remain constructive, and we do believe we will have a legislative result within a short period of time. The administration, as I say, has been really accepting and participating in the drafting phase, and their expertise is a helpful contribution to our efforts. Some of the issues we're looking at, as well as trying to streamline the FDA and the NIH in terms of biomedical research, are issues of how do we incorporate portions of the Software Act as part of 21st Century Cures, and also issues of data sharing between the various federal agencies that have an impact over health care. Now, without a final draft yet, Chairman Upton and I don't have any details about precisely how we're going to address these issues. But the innovation that networked medical treatment it's a core motivation between 21st Century Cures. And so we want to do everything that we can to encourage these developments in ways that keep patients, their safety, and their privacy at the forefront. So with that, that's what we're working on. I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have about 21st Century Cures and how we can better incorporate healthcare technologies. Thank you. I know someone has a question. Yes.
So, how do you, from a legislating point of view, get the balance right between, positive incentives and regulations to get the private sector to really collaborate with the FDA and other agencies to produce the right result for citizens?
Well, I always like the carrot versus the stick approach. I think it usually works best. We have since we've had for so long, since we've been already discussing this legislation, it's helped us to meet with industry and figure out what works and doesn't work. The other advantage that we have is that that we have some innovative thinkers over at the FDA right now who recognize that maybe we don't need the FDA regulating Fitbits, for example, but there might be some other things that we can look at. And so we're really trying to work this in a way that works for industry and also works for patient safety. This isn't really in this isn't really in the cyber area, but it's part of what we're trying to deal with. I had a guy come in and he said to me, "I found this cure for it's a blood-based cure for disease, and the FDA won't approve it, and it's perfectly safe." And I said, "Well, does it work?" And he said, "Well, who cares?" I said, "Well, wait a minute. You're going to be going to CMS for reimbursement of this treatment, which is $5,000. I think we have to show efficacy as well as safety." And this is the same thing in the device arena. We need to make sure that we're not just allowing a marketplace of crystals that you wave over people and stuff like that. But on the other hand, we have to give enough room for innovation. Something else that in my many years in Congress that's always challenging is the challenge of legislating not legislating to a particular situation at the time, legislating broad parameters so that when there are innovations, the statutes aren't acting as barriers to innovation. An example I like to give of that is when Congress passed the Telecom Act in 1996. Think of what's happened in the almost 20 years now since the Telecom Act in terms of technology, areas that those members of Congress could have never imagined then. And it's the same thing with medical devices now. Things that are going to be there in 10 years, we're not even imagining right now. We need to give room. On the one hand, we need to protect patient safety, but on the other hand, we need to give room for innovation in that space. And that's what we're trying to achieve. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for your comments. Jason Healy from the Atlanta Council. As we were doing the report, we found everyone accepted, yes, there's going to be these benefits, and yes, there's going to be these risks. But when we said healthcare Internet of Things could lead to cheaper care, it could help bring down medical costs, we actually got a fair amount of pushback on that, of people saying, oh, that's always promised, and we never get there. I'm curious your thoughts as you're looking at this legislation. Do you see the promise that this might actually bring down costs, or is this going to increase costs because this is all expensive stuff?
Well, it depends on how you look at it, and this has been a pet peeve of mine for many, many years. Is of course, if you look at the cost of this insulin pump and continuous glucose monitor, for example, it's expensive. But if you look at the savings that you have in terms of complications down the road, not just medical treatment, but also the emotional and human savings that you have, then you can really see how these devices save money. And sadly, the Congressional Budget Office, they score new innovations on the actual cost rather than the savings that they have down the road. And so I'll give you an example. When we did the Medicare Part D prescription drug bill some years ago, I tried to put an amendment in there to cover the cost of smoking cessation under Medicare for senior citizens. And Joe Barton was the chairman of the committee at the time. And I went to Joe and I said, Joe, I think we should put that in there. And he said, I'd love to put it in there. The problem is I've been given a $50 billion price tag from my leadership, and it costs money for the smoking cessation treatments. And I said, but Joe, think of how much money we'll save in emphysema and lung cancer and heart attacks and everything else. He said, that's not the way the CBO scores it. And so right now I'm working on a bill. It's kind of backwards, isn't it? And so I'm working on a bill right now with Congressman Mike Burgess from Texas, a Republican. And this bill, what it will do is it'll change the way the CBO scores biomedical advances by looking at, and of course it would have to be demonstrated by evidence. You couldn't just come in and say, oh, I think I'm going to save a lot of money. You'd have to have evidence showing the benefits. But if our bill passed, then it would change the way we think about prevention and treatments. So we're thinking, Congressman Burgess and I are talking about ways we can try to incorporate some of those concepts into 21st century cures, because that makes more sense. Sometimes people find much more complex ways to deal with a simple problem, but sometimes there's technology that may be expensive but may save a lot of money down the road. Yes.
Thank you for your comments. My name is Tanel Sepp. I'm from the Embassy of Estonia.
Oh, great.
I was wondering about your ideas, how you would resolve the conflict between information sharing and data protection. Estonian President Ilves has been very active also in e-health questions, and he has one really good quote, is that privacy questions have certain different meanings. I mean, for healthcare issues, I would not mind if you knew my blood type, but I would mind if somebody starts changing my blood type in certain systems. So my question is, how do you resolve the data privacy issues and information sharing, and how do you integrate the cybersecurity component there?
Well, I think that the first thing to realize is that somebody's personal information should be their property. And then you go out from there. So my medical information is my property, and I should be the one that gets to determine how far I want to go. I may not want people to know even my blood type, or I might not care if they know all the rest of my information. I think that needs to be the property of the patient. And I think in terms of releasing that information, patients need to, this is one thing also we're working on in our bill, patients need to if their data is going to be shared, then they need to have informed consent about exactly where that data will be shared, how it will be retained, and what the parameters will be. It's interesting, when you poll most Americans, they say that they would be willing to have their health information put into a central data bank registry to be used by researchers, but what they don't want is to see their personal medical information out on the internet or being shared with their employer. And so what you have to do is you have to develop very strong patient protections, consent forms, and then you have to back that up with systems that do protect it. So even most patients and most people agree that they would want their data shared if it was going to help with a research study that could lead to cures, but they want to make sure that that is protected. And so that needs to be built in to the whole patient study process, and then those protections need to be built in. Another issue that we've been dealing with in 21st century cures is the issue of HIPAA, the health privacy. And it's interesting, and we've seen this even with our own daughter, is sometimes people will say, well, we can't share that information because of HIPAA. And in fact, HIPAA doesn't prohibit it. The lawyers for the institution prohibit it. And I say that as a lawyer myself. And so you have to figure out, is it actually HIPAA as written or HIPAA as interpreted? And we want to make sure we have strong patient protections, but we also want to give the ability to have this information shared. And I didn't even, that'll be the subject for my next speech about how we're going to do the whole patient research system in this country, so that it's going to encourage more collaboration between institutions and centralized registries. Yes, and then
Josh Corman, I'm the founder of a group of white hat researchers who are volunteering pro bono time to things that affect public safety and human life. Your story about your daughter struck a chord. One of our researchers also is a diabetic, and he found material weakness that could get him killed in 2 different manufacturers. We're trying to raise education awareness and bring our domain expertise to the legislative and public education discussions. Is there a vehicle for a group such as ours to participate, and if so, what's the best way to engage?
well, you can go online. Where's Matt? What's the website? Cures? Or you can go on my website and you can link into it. And we are still taking comments, but we are drafting right now. So speed is the word. Yes. Yes, ma'am, back here.
Ago. The FDA came out with some final guidance on medical device systems and Fitbits and connected medical devices and everything like that. It seemed to please a lot of the industry. The FDA said they were going to be hands-off and discretion from the beginning, and they came through with that. After seeing that and getting feedback on software, how necessary do you still think getting it into legislation is, and how much of that did you take into account as you're redrafting?
We've been talking to it's interesting because a lot of people in the device development world were concerned about overregulation, potential overregulation of things like Fitbits and other types of healthcare devices, and the FDA said all along that they were not intending to regulate those devices. It's a fine line because they have to make sure that if a device is actually implanted in a patient or is affecting their like putting insulin in their body or cancer drugs or something else, that they do oversee that. So we were pleased to see the guidance. We've been working with the FDA on what they would want to see in statute around that. And so they're working very closely with us. We also have a number of other provisions in the bill that we're looking at that relate to devices that people actually might be excited to see. I mentioned the Software Act, for example, and also breakthrough devices, a similar type of concept as to the breakthrough therapies for drugs. So there's a number of device provisions that we're looking at in the bill. Well, thank you so much for having me this morning, and I hope the rest of your day goes extremely well. Take care. Thank you.
All right. Well, so first, thanks all of you for attending today. I'm actually thrilled to have an opportunity to speak to you, and I actually want to thank the Atlantic Council on the report. I think it's a great piece of work. And I was reading the report and a few things that I actually wanted to share with you. I think what this report does, it actually lays out to really educate the industry on the opportunities, the evolution of healthcare when it comes to connected devices. But what it also does is it really helps set the best path forward and helps educate governments, device manufacturers, which we've actually talked about today, as well as practitioners themselves. What are the best approaches? And it actually does call out that security is one of the challenges that we actually have to deal with from the onset. It actually sets a series of recommendations that really will help governments and device manufacturers and practitioners maximize the value to patients, but at the same time reducing the potential implications of security issues that can come through software, firmware, or the protocols that are actually used. And when I read the document, my key takeaway from this document is that we have to make sure that security is built into these devices from the get-go. We can't bolt on security after the fact. And when you take a look at the document, while it actually describes some of the challenges, it also talks about some of the societal opportunities. And I wanted to call out a few of them for you, because I think they're pretty interesting. One of them was 48% of practitioners today have already integrated consumer devices into their IT systems. 48%, that's pretty large. It also calls out a potential $63 billion in savings globally if there is adoption of these connected devices. Now that's a huge number. It also calls out that over 60% of practitioners have already begun doing basic security audits on these devices. So the good news is that practitioners are actually seeing that this is a potential challenge and they're taking this into their own hands. Now, the Francesca story is actually one that's pretty touching, and I think that obviously there's huge medical benefits and it's changing people's lives. But this is really the age of the possible. And when you take a look at what's happening, the Fitbits, and I think the example of the Fitbits is a funny one, because I was with my 7-year-old niece over the weekend, and she was proudly showing me that she had reached 10,000 steps. And this is a personal challenge that she's taking on a daily basis, and it's changing her quality of life. But the implications of that is the explosion of devices. It's no longer hundreds of thousands or millions of devices, it's tens of millions, hundreds of millions of devices that we're dealing with. And those devices is the key reason why security has to be something that we're thinking through from the get-go. You know, it's interesting, the document really calls out 3 key risks. The first one is really around the patient privacy, the importance of data. And when you take a look at data today, patient data, the underground community is placing a higher value on patient data than credit card data. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot of thefts, a lot of breaches. And in fact, today's event is kind of timely. It actually comes right after yesterday's disclosure by Primera, where somewhere near 11 million patients have their data may have been compromised. Add 90 million patient data that may have been compromised in January by Anthem, and that's 91 million patients. Now that means we're one breach away from hitting 100 million. That's a large number. And so in addition to that, it also calls out potentially some of the implications of malicious attacks or malicious use of these devices. And while it's important for a doctor to be able to remotely control or monitor the devices, as in Francesca's story, it's also possible for the underground community to actually use that in a very malicious way. And what I mean by that is it could be malicious actors, or it could be terrorism as well, that's actually looking to compromise or taking advantage of a specific security flaw. And that would affect the lives of millions and millions of users. And so with that, I want to thank Atlantic Council. It was a great report. I think it lays out what we need to do as an industry. And I really challenge the industry as a whole to take security as a number one priority as we enter this new world. Thank you.
Right. Can we get rid of that? Great. Thank you very much for the Congressman and for Pat for kicking us off. Again, I'm Jay Healy from the Atlantic Council. Thanks for joining. And can we have the so we're not going to do extensive introductions of everyone because you have our bios in your package, but we're going to go from specific to general, starting on my left with Suzanne to hear about FDA and what they've got in, and then Josh and hear what the white hat hacker community has been involved with in trying to make improvements here, and then have Pat on cleanup because he's got perhaps the widest view here when we're talking about security. And so Suzanne, it was interesting because we've heard it. I think it was really interesting the way the Congresswoman phrased this, because it's almost like a report. You've got all the you've got the benefits, there are these downsides. part of what we're trying to do with this series of reports is not focus on the doom and gloom of hackers can kill, but really talk about the benefits that we can unlock if we get security right. And it's when you start talking about it, you can get into the benefits that almost sound magical. But I'm really curious how you at FDA, you look at these benefits and how you make those trade-offs with the potential risk.
So thanks, Jay. And I think that the Congresswoman really set the stage very, very well for this discussion in terms of her focus being on the extraordinary opportunities for innovation in medical device world and in medical technology. And we at FDA, and I come from the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, are indeed thrilled, with the innovation and with the capabilities, the opportunities out there, the possibilities are really, the sky's the limit. This is very exciting to us. We actually held a workshop, a public workshop back in October of 2014, where in my opening remarks, we talked about the amazing direction that technology is going, and that much of it, as the representative said, is actually unforeseen. And so fostering that type of innovation is indeed very, very important to us, and doing it, though, within the framework of what would be, safe and effective, because obviously this comes back down to our core mission at the FDA, which is to protect, but also to promote and to advance public health. And I will put the emphasis here on the advancement of public health so that we're not compromising the opportunity for technology to be able to get out there to patients. One of the other principles that was mentioned in the keynote was this idea of being able to discern those areas where it would be important for the FDA to maintain regulatory oversight versus those areas where, as technology continues to advance, in particular for general health and wellness, so the Fitbit as a prime example, those are not areas where FDA sees necessity to have, a direct authority or direct oversight. And so I think, the bottom line is that we're looking in very innovative ways to be able to foster, to push those technologies, to help industry push those technologies out without having regulation impede that.
Yeah. But how do you make the trade-offs? I mean, it almost seems like there's a rule that the more awesome the technology is, the more excited that we get, that when we say, oh my God, what if someone did X, Y, or Z, like the degree of holy crap, I don't know what the official way to say that is kind of proportional to the amount of excitement. And that's got to make it very difficult, because you want to allow that innovation, but you also want to limit the downsides. And
so that's where the framework of, first of all, everything that we do is with a risk-benefit or a benefit-risk type of calculus or analysis. And that goes, again, to the very core of how we regulate, and in terms of quality systems regulations, and being able to make sure that risk management is well built into the framework that industry is using as new devices are being designed. So to the points that have been previously made, one of the key concepts that we continue to underscore is the idea of not bolting on, but baking into the design, to really thinking in the design of these extraordinary technologies, the security that needs to be absolutely a integral component there. Now, clearly, I think that, and Josh, you can answer this even better than I can, the possibility of being able to eliminate all risk does not exist, and we recognize that, and that's why everything is, a risk-related decision. That is how the FDA regulates drugs and biologics and devices as well. You're never going to eliminate all risk. You're never going to eliminate all vulnerabilities, but it's the idea of being able to manage that risk appropriately, and to give the industry the tools by which, or for us to articulate to industry what those tools are to manage the risk, and what our expectations are with respect to that. So we came out with a guidance document in October of 2014 that reflected what our expectations were on the pre-market side. In other words, as new devices are being built, and what what we see needing to happen again, and it follows within the foundational core or framework of quality systems regulation without requiring any new regulation or statute. I think that much of what we face, though, as an ecosystem, is really more of the products that are out there, the devices that are in the field, the legacy devices that that we live with, basically, because they are very, very expensive pieces of equipment, and the turnover in terms of those products, the life cycle of that product, is very different than the way technology is actually moving.
And Pat, in his comments, had talked about Primera. We know a bunch of other healthcare companies that have had breaches. But if you have and most of those are on the records get stolen side. If you have a company that makes sensitive devices, do they have to report to FDA if they've suffered a breach? Like if someone takes the the details of like Francesca's device, does that have to get reported to government?
There is a post-market surveillance program. There is a reporting mechanism by which to do that. It is. Again, our expectation that if that were to occur, that would be reported. To date, we're not aware of any malicious intent or malicious actual attacks on devices. That's something that we recognize is certainly a possibility in the future as we're living in a world of heightened threat, and so. That's it's something that we definitely want to be able to keep a close eye on.
And that seems like the transition to Josh there. Thanks for making that. So Josh, you'd already kind of given the introduction of the group of I Am the Cavalry, this group of white hat hackers that you've helped assemble to get together to say we have these important life safety issues that we want to take a look at in healthcare, in automobiles. And other places of these cyber physical systems. And so what's the state of play when it's coming to, especially in healthcare devices?
So we started at DEF CON 22 about a year and a half ago, and it was essentially fathers and mothers and elder statesmen, I guess, in the cybersecurity research community that had recognized that while we joined this profession as a hobby, and we weren't paying attention, it became our profession. And then once again, now we weren't paying attention, and connected technology permeates every aspect of your life. It's in your cars, your medical devices, your homes, your critical infrastructure. And as we know from our day jobs, anything that has software is hackable, and anything that has a connection is exposed. So we saw that our initial problem statement was the sober recognition that our dependence on connected technology was growing much faster than our ability to secure it. And our terrible name of I Am the Cavalry was born out of the notion that when we went as high and deep as we could in the government, in the executive branch, in the intelligence community, we were looking for the adults. And when we naively believed if we get the right message to the right decision makers, they'd fix it.
But by the way, I like I Am the Cavalry better than I Am the Adult.
Yeah.
So I think there you made the right choice.
Good point. So it was really just the sobering recognition that the cavalry isn't coming. And why do we expect the outside world to know these things? This is our expertise. So as in a multi-stakeholder situation like medical devices, like cars, we have a role to play, and it was a personal declaration that I will be part of the solution. I'll be a voice of reason and technical literacy. And we've really fashioned ourselves to be more of an ambassador and educator to public policymakers, executive branch, and the public at large. And what we've noticed is material weakness in a lot of these devices. And it just stands to reason. In many ways, it was the failure of the security industry because we allowed people to believe that we had a pretty good handle on cybersecurity. But I think if you watch the news over the last 2 years, there's more than a breach a week on different fronts. And while that dependence is rising, we haven't risen to the challenges quickly. So we think we have a lot of ground to make up. And the answer isn't to scare people with lions and tigers and bears. The answer isn't to point out failures in legacy devices. It's to be a helping hand instead of a pointing finger. And we're taking a long view where we are seeing an increased connectivity level, an increased amount of software on these devices. And we hadn't seen in our quiet workings with individual vendors, there's some disconnects between are we allowed to patch our devices? We didn't cover myths and facts and fiction, but many device manufacturers said, well, we can't even patch our devices if there's a security flaw like Heartbleed, because we'd have to go through rigorous recertification. Is that true?
So that is not true. Thank you for that cue.
take it
We've
back
got
in a
our
minute,
props
but-
here,
Yeah.
our guidance, which actually speaks to that. And we have said this verbally many times at many meetings, but just for the sake of making that point, I'm going to read out of the October guidance the statement which states that with regard to cybersecurity of medical devices, and this is for pre-market.
I want everyone tweeting this. That's live tweeting. Let's get the word out.
So a summary describing the plan for providing validated software updates and patches as needed throughout the life cycle of the medical device to continue to assure its safety and effectiveness. The FDA typically will not need to review or approve medical device software changes made solely to strengthen cybersecurity. So again, this is something that, in terms of debunking this myth that every time a software update or a patch needs to happen, that a company would need to come into the FDA with a new 510K or submission. That is not the case. So that's stated right there. This guidance is out in the public domain.
Do other nations' regulators require it? So they're not for FDA, but how about the other main markets like EU or Japan? Or how are we coordinating between those?
So I'm not the best person to speak to the coordination. I will tell you that my colleague, Mr. Bakul Patel, who heads now the digital health office or program within the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, has been doing an enormous amount of work, ambassadorship within the international sphere with regard to software of medical devices, cybersecurity on an international front.
Yeah, go ahead, Josh. And I ask especially because we have a lot of European embassies that are represented here, Josh.
A lot of the circular logic has come to the fact that, well, no one's been killed due to a hack of a medical device or some similar claim. And what we've noticed, at least in the automotive, which we'll get to in a bit, I believe, but what we lack is the proper scaffolding and the foundational capabilities to ready ourselves for these moments. You might recall in U.S. history, we had rampant pollution around the 1900s. And it took the Cuyahoga River in Ohio catching on fire and staying on fire for days before we finally said, okay, maybe we should do something about this. And if you think of it from a practical sense, because we're the more mature part of the research community, if we wait for that moment, if we wait for a high-profile mistake, there's a very long lead time in the research and development, the manufacturing, the approval, the matriculation into market. So we've really focused on making sure future strategic investments have foundational capabilities. We had a very intense debate with a medical advisor to the FDA who said, there's no evidence of anyone hacking this device, there's no money in it. And there's a whole bunch of bad assumptions in there, including the fact that money is not the only motivation for causing harm. There was no money in the Boston Marathon bombers, there's no money in the motivation of ISIS. There are several different adversaries in the human condition, accidents and adversaries. But moreover, we said, well, you cannot simultaneously cry there's no evidence of hacking and tampering when there is no required evidence capture. So you can't perpetually say there's no evidence. And the automotive industry has a similar problem. So what we're really looking at is 5 postures towards failure for people that make devices or cars that can affect public safety and human life. And the slang version of it is, how do we avoid failure? How do we take help avoiding failure? How do we capture and learn from failure? How do we have a prompt and agile response to failure? And how do we contain and isolate failure? And there's this framework we've initially published for the automotive cyber safety framework. And in a few months, at some medical conferences, we'll be publishing a similar one for medical.
When will that? When do you just kind of hand wavy?
When our multiple stakeholders feel comfortable. But we're targeting the middle of the year.
And so my last question on this before I shift to Pat is, you see when you're coming to manufacturers of all different kinds, you see different reactions to security researchers saying you have vulnerabilities here that will lead to failure. At last DEF CON, Tesla had a car there, and they said hackers come play on this. And you saw these nerds, like all over this thing, trying to figure out how they can break it so that Tesla can learn. That is so different than, say, voting machines, where it is stay away. You're probably committing a felony if you open this thing. How are you finding it in medical?
Yeah, and that's star number 2. So I'm really happy you asked about this. This almost catalyzes your evolutionary growth. It's a number two was, do you have a published coordinated disclosure policy stating that you will not sue third-party researchers acting in good faith? So there's a bunch of ISO standards on how do you do this with common protocols, but the act of inviting participation from the research community accelerates your learning curve. You're getting free research, you're getting quiet, private, discrete feedback. It's becoming new abuse cases and use cases for your design requirements, and your manufacturing company and the ecosystem and the FDA set of cohorts become smarter. And short of opening that door with a welcome mat instead of a beware of dog sign, has really stifled some of these industries. And that's not going to fix everything, but it puts you on a path to doing so.
Good. I saw a great tweet joke the other day, and only the nerds are going to laugh at this. A security researcher walks into a bar, orders a beer, then orders -1 beer, then orders AAAA beers, then orders. So if you're a nerd, you laughed at that. Okay, Pat. So you've been writing and talking about trading off security in search for better performance, and that seems like a lot of what we're talking about here. I'm sure a lot of people that are innovating in this space would say the security is going to hold us back, and we can't afford to make those trade-offs. It's the wrong time to be making those trade-offs.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you look in the IT world and you look at the medical device field. There are corollaries. There's areas where there's a lot of semblances. And we did a piece of research about maybe 8 months ago, looking at IT and how does IT protect itself. And some of you may be familiar with firewalls, but firewalls are typically considered the device that protects the network from a lot of breaches. And of course, it's interesting to see that there's more investments going on in firewalls, and yet breaches continue to increase. And what we found in this piece of research is that more than 40% of IT individuals actually turn off security because it hampers the performance of the firewall.
40%?
About 40%. Yeah, so it's kind of a large number. So it's been an education that we've been doing. We've been trying to educate the market around the need to re-enable security, and a lot of this has to do with, can you make sure that security and performance actually work hand in hand? And I think when you look at medical devices, there's a lot of the same challenges. But I would actually look at the manufacturers, and I would say that this is not necessarily a new problem. When I was working in a previous job, I was working primarily on Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi was becoming predominant in a lot of these medical devices. The problem was that the device manufacturers were not specialists in Wi-Fi. They were specialists in heart pumps or insulin pumps or whatever. They didn't necessarily know how to implement those technologies in a safe manner. But what we're doing now as an industry, Intel specifically, is we're providing the industry with a platform that they can leverage and that they can use, so they don't have to become specialists in an Internet of Thing platform. They can really focus on their area of specialty, whether it's insulin or whether it happens to be measuring how many steps you've done today, and do that in a safe manner. And so things like upgrades, that has always been a challenge. How do you do that in a way that's consistent, a way that's actually easy for the user but also safe? And I think this is an opportunity for Intel to step up and really help the manufacturers adopt a platform and not have to worry about those things.
That's great. And by the way, I'm about 2,200 steps today. We were interested in those, and we came in some in the report. I'm sure there's others. We were saying, boy, if we have so many of these device manufacturers, they're just bespoke. I mean, they are small software shops. They don't have, a good, resilient, repeatable, institutionalized software engineering process. And we know, we are decades enough into this that know that if you don't have a good institutionalized, repeatable software process, you're never going to catch your vulnerabilities and your mistakes. So we were talking about things like code library, common libraries, open source code, so that way everyone can save money and be efficient while also using common libraries so that you can improve. Is that the kind of thing that you mean by platform, or you mean something different?
Well, that is a good part of it. I think a lot of it, as well as we're delivering to the industry a platform that they can actually build on. So let's just use, for instance, a heart pump, right? So you need the operating system, you need the actual device itself, you need the security capabilities, the security libraries, as you would call it. All that needs to become part of the platform. So the manufacturer is really focused on the individual, the actual technology that they're trying to enable. Of course, the underlying platform itself has to be very secure, but that is really where Intel steps in.
Josh?
To piggyback on that, in my day job, I'm the CTO of Sonatype, which is founded on an open source project. And as such, I'm the custodian of the largest repository of open source code in the world. And I know which companies on the planet are using which projects and which vulnerable projects. So there's a stunning number of automakers, industrial control systems, and medical device manufacturers using very old, known vulnerable, highly exploitable code in their products. And it's not a level of hygiene as a planet. We've really matured to start looking at the integrity of our software supply chain. There's a tremendous amount of hardware supply chain or vendor supply chain integrity, but only after last year with Heartbleed, Shell Shock, Poodle, all these, I basically say it's open season on open source. It's that the shared value we get out of open source code to stand on the shoulders of giants becomes a shared attack surface and a shared risk. So, harkening back to something both of you said, we clearly have to do costs and benefits, risks and rewards. The challenge is you can't make a risk-reward trade-off if you have an incomplete definition of the risks. Yeah. And it's human nature to adopt technology for their immediate obvious benefits, and we seldom do a comprehensive risk analysis. And at least our finding for state of practice and state of play is a lot of manufacturers, when they talk about safety, they're looking at intended by design use case. And as you know, hackers look for abuse case. And if Heartbleed's on a medical device, you can manipulate it to your will, not to its intended uses. And as such, I think this is going to be one of the pivot points this year, is expanding the scope of what costs and benefits, risks and rewards are. And just, as a health-related one, think of asbestos. It was cheap, it was fire retardant, it went everywhere, the benefits were clear. And now not a day goes by where I'm not seeing some sort of mesothelioma, I can't even pronounce it right, because now we know, what, asbestos is really, really bad for us. So I want to make sure that in our rampant adoption of all the obvious benefits of device technology, we're at least weaning out the elective risks and the known vulnerabilities.
So, but, if I could just add, this is really interesting, and it points to the exact problem the industry has. If a manufacturer is trying to build a device Y, whatever it happens to be, and has a plethora of different open source libraries that they can go after, thousands. They don't necessarily have the people to do a security audit of all that code, and that's the challenge. That's why someone like Intel, for example, can come in, because we have those resources. We do some of that. We could put together that platform that we've done the security audit, so we know when working with the device manufacturer X that it actually it doesn't necessarily have the compromises. That's where we can partner. We're not specialists in insulin pumps and and so on, but we certainly understand how to build devices. Exactly. Exactly.
And that was very much the theme of the public workshop that was convened in terms of really making this about whole of community, and that it does require this aspect of partnering, and that there's no finger pointing, there's no blame at any one stakeholder group here, but that the complexity and the magnitude and the uncertainty as well of the problem requires that that there has to be this ceasing from a lot of the stovepiping and siloing, and really starting to kind of work across what the needs are in terms of building these devices better. We've also seen a lot of shift in terms of the mindset of manufacturers and understanding that it isn't, what those unintended uses could actually look like. And so in the conversations that we have been having internally at the FDA within our cybersecurity work group, as we think about what's out there in the field, and with those conversations along with our industry stakeholders, we're definitely seeing a paradigm shift in terms of how manufacturers, and then also how the end user side, how the hospitals and the hospital CISOs and the hospital biomed engineers are thinking about this problem. So as we start to see also these self-organizing kind of networks or consortia of groups that really bring everybody who's part of this ecosystem together towards what has to be done, or how can we leverage the different assets of different parts of the private industry in order to be able to enable stronger cybersecurity.
Yeah. I've got one more question, but if you want to, after this, then we'll go to audience Q&A. So if you want to start catching my eye, if you have a question. So let me be a grump. I've been in this business long enough, and I always thought we would have this solved by now. And you've talked about, all right, we've had the firewalls over 25 years old now, and yet we're still not really getting our arms around how to do that right. why should we think that we're going to be able to do well on this? And that was just a firewall. I mean, it's not that complicated a piece of technology. Here we're talking about really important stuff that is kind of complicated and is a lot more important if it fails. Do you think should we be optimistic that we can get this right?
Well, so I think the challenge is 25 years ago, we didn't quite imagine what the threats would actually look like.
True.
And it's really interesting when you take a look at firewalls, and again, we're just using that as an example, but firewalls in general, even though they're 25 years old, the way that they're built, yeah, the bells and whistles are a little different, but the underlying architecture of a firewall fundamentally has not changed in 25 years. And we have well-known vulnerabilities in products today. There's something called an advanced evasion technique that I'd say the malicious community actually knows how to take advantage of. And the fact that the underlying architecture has not changed is one of the reasons why this exists. And now what we're starting to see is players like Intel Security stepping up and drastically changing the architecture of security devices to make sure that we're locking down a lot of these known threats. I think we have an opportunity in the medical field where, as this becomes pervasive, let's get in front of it. Let's not do what we did with firewalls and wait until it's too late. Now we have a pretty good indication of what threats actually look like. Of course, we can't imagine everything between now and 25 years from now. But we have a fair amount of experience around what are the weaknesses that these devices actually can expose, and we can get in front of it. I do believe
I'm going to be totally cyborg in 25 years. I am no doubt about that. I'm really looking forward to it. Okay, I'm going to go to Josh and then Danielle.
You pushed the right button. I'm gonna be mad at you later. We spend about 80 billion, according to Gartner, on cybersecurity. About 80 billion annually, protecting mostly credit cards. Firewalls, antivirus. When I was an analyst, I tracked 140 product categories that are spent to protect enterprises and mostly credit cards. Nearly 100% of merchants, if you look at the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, have had a material breach of credit cards. That strategy is an abject failure. If that failure rate carries over to areas that affect public safety and human life, like our cars, our medical devices, with higher consequences, it's completely unacceptable. The emperor has no clothes. I'm not trying to say the industry cannot make adjustments. I'm saying a sober reflection on the failure rates for banks, for credit card companies, when they are attempting to invest, the failure rate's nearly 100%. We cannot get to a point where we look back and say what fools we were to put such a level of software and connected technology in areas affecting public safety and human life. So pardon the indignation. I think we can rise to the challenge, but I want to flip it and say let's not rely and depend on the technology until we realize it was a mistake. Let's flip it, and the burden of proof instead is the dependence should be commensurate with something that is trustworthy. And I'm not suggesting we go to formal methods and EAL certifications. Too many acronyms, sorry. But Dan Geer likes to talk about security in terms of dependence. And your choice is you can either depend upon it less or make it more dependable. And I think we blindly assumed that cybersecurity was pretty good. But I think the facts would argue that our failure rate's near 100%. And I think we really need a gut check before we have very high-profile consequences.
And I don't like running a Cyber Risk Wednesday unless we invoke Dan Geer. So
well, I need to respond to that, and I would argue that the problem is not necessarily a technology problem; it's the use of technology. And so when I take a look at the industry as a whole, and on the IT side, because that's the example that you actually raised, the general tendency is you have there's a trend that's been going on for the past 5 years, so it's very clear: new threat, new box. A new vendor, new box. New threat, new vendor, new box. And so when you take a look at what most of our customers actually deal with, it's a plethora of devices. They don't even know how to deal with it. And if you look at some of the retail breaches that happened last year, there were indications that there was an issue. The problem is they had so many boxes, they didn't even know where to look anymore. And so what we're actually seeing in the corporate world is a change in how they actually look at security. And it's not having just a collection of boxes that work in silos, it's how does everything work together as an architecture so that you actually have better visibility and context on a particular event in one place of the network can be shared across the network. And now you actually have something to work off of. So I would argue that it's not necessarily a technology problem, but how it was used. But clearly the industry is seeing exactly what you're talking about and is is stepping up.
The end in a positive.
And but this is one of the things that came out in this report, and frankly, a lot of the work that we've been doing, a lot of the work that Intel Security's been doing, is we've got to have things that are going to be able to scale. You know, you can't do the threat box. I mean, that process you talked about. We need things that you can do once, and they're going to work a billion times, and that's why we really want to talk about secure by design as one of the ways. So, first question, Danielle. The microphone is going to come back, and if you can just say your name and where you're from.
Thanks. I'm Danielle Kriz. I run the cybersecurity policy work at the Information Technology Industry Council, one of the main high-tech trade associations here in DC. I do have a question or point for Suzanne, but I actually wanted to echo what you just said. I completely agree that cybersecurity is not just a technology issue. So much of it has to do with people and how they integrate technology, how they use it, if they're actually allocating their resources for the right risks. So totally agree with that. My question for Suzanne is kind of to piggyback off of something Jay asked you about, and I wanted to echo. So I'm also not an expert in insulin pumps, but I have many years of experience doing cybersecurity policy and international trade. Mm-hmm. And the question about whether the FDA is talking with or coordinating with a lot of the other governments around the world as you think about, your cybersecurity policies related to healthcare devices, it's critically important that you be talking with other governments as well as industries around the world because, for industry, we need globally compatible cybersecurity policies and, country-specific requirements are bad for security as well as trade. So, if there's someone in FDA who is working on that, I would love to talk with them, but just wanted to say how important that is. So it's not really a question, but more of a statement.
And I could certainly absolutely echo that sentiment. So and I could point you in the direction of who that would be. The IMDRF meeting, I believe, is actually coming up this coming week or next week in Tokyo, and we do have representation there who will be speaking very specifically to issues of how we view cybersecurity and, again, creating more of, I don't know that we would go so far as to call it harmonization internationally, but certainly in terms of getting everyone on the same page with our international regulators, with our colleagues there. Mm-hmm.
Yep. I saw Randy, and then here, and then three.
Hi, I'm Randall Fort with Raytheon. So this has been a fascinating discussion, and I'm trying to now process and integrate all the points that you've made. So it sounds like from the comments, Suzanne, you said doctors and, well, first of all, the technology is going to go relentlessly, exponentially onward. So billions, tens of billions, and then maybe 1 trillion objects, Internet of Things in the next 15 years. While I don't know if we're necessarily dithering, but while we're still talking about what we want to do, that just keeps going forward. So it sounds like there may be some seeds of optimism. Suzanne, you said doctors and hospitals and CISOs are kind of starting now to think about this technology. Pat, you said industry council, there's a couple of places people are thinking about trying to do this, but where's the center of gravity, and when will this become the norm and not the exception, not these folks out on the edge? What is there a tipping point? Is there a tipping point that we can manufacture? Is it a regulatory matter that we have to insist that some standard happen? Is it a punitive matter? If you don't do these things, then there will be significant disincentives in terms of punishments, lawsuits, that kind of thing. What will, beyond goodwill and kumbaya, what's going to push this to become the norm, the standard, where people begin to, Josh, you said stop using this awful code that it's out there and people go to. Why do they do it? It's cheap, it's fast, cycle time, got to get the product out there, got to beat the competition. How do we incentivize all the good things that you're talking about?
Great question. And then why don't we start with whoever wants to take it. Suzanne, Pat, you look like you were going to jump on it, so why don't you go ahead.
most of these billions of devices obviously have some form of a processor that's actually built in. And so the way that we're trying to influence the industry is when they come to us and say, hey, we're trying to build XYZ, whatever it happens to be, and so we're looking at what are your processors, we're not just going to provide them with a processor, we'll provide them with that foundational toolkit, all the capabilities it needs to make sure the device is actually safe out of the gate. And so the relationship we're trying to have with the device manufacturers is exactly that, be more than just a supplier, but basically the one that provides them with, with this whole platform. The advantage to them is that it reduces their investment, because in the past where they had to go through millions of source code, or thousands of different possible open source libraries, they still have to do that to a certain extent based on what they're trying to build, but we're going to provide them with everything they need to make sure that they're building a secure platform so they can focus on their area of expertise.
Yeah, Josh.
I think this space moves really, really fast, and to be able, I really love the Congresswoman's comments about we don't want to make these really brittle, static constraints that might stifle free market innovation. So the approach that Cavalry's taken with the auto, and we're going to do here, is one of education and transparency. So we want to allow rationally self-interested individuals or organizations or manufacturers make more comprehensive risk-reward trade-off decisions. And what's stunningly missing is actionable information and comprehensive knowledge about these things. And that's why instead of trying to prescribe, you should use a firewall and antivirus. Do you want to pick out an antivirus product for your insulin pump? Do you want to pick a Trend or Kaspersky antivirus for your car? Of course not. I hope not. So instead, what we really want to drive is articulate the steps that you as a manufacturer take to secure the safety of your patients. And let the free market kind of choose. But more importantly, the reason we've emphasized the collaboration with researchers and the evidence capture is we need to, just like the NTSB does with air crashes, we want to study and learn from failure so we can get smarter as an entire ecosystem. And until we can put the scaffolding in place to support said transparency, said evidence capture, said learning, I think we're just going to be doing a lot of guesswork. So I would argue that it starts with providing more data, more information, and more transparency.
Yeah, great.
So if I can just piggyback on Josh's comments and on Pat's comments, many of which, we see similar themes in terms of the FDA, some of the things that we've been doing. Well, let me just take a step back and also say that none of us want to be in a reactive mode. We don't want to wait for that terrible event or that catastrophic thing to happen that's then going to propel a lot of activity. Our stance has been over the past 18 months especially to be much more proactive and forward-leaning. And in doing that, recognizing where, first of all, there are basic gaps in education, informing, increasing awareness. My goodness, so much of what we have done, which might seem like soft work, but in terms of educating the healthcare institution, the provider side, as to what these concerns are. Many of them we've come to learn were not necessarily, did not have that level of awareness. And patching, but and also just even you want to talk about even the clinicians, the providers, in terms of understanding what's behind the device, and therefore what are the capabilities, or if it were to be used in a way that it's not intended to be used, and to rethink what that actually might mean. I mean, so there's a lot of the education outreach aspect that we have engaged in addition to the idea of convening, of bringing folks together. And I want to really emphasize what Josh mentioned in terms of the importance of the security researcher in this context, because in the past, so there's a real shift that's been happening here that we're observing, which has been very positive, in that instead of even the manufacturer and the community in general becoming rather alarmed and pushing away the security researcher, we recognize the importance and the value of what the security researcher can provide in terms of gathering that data and being part of that process to hack away at this device, while it's in its design phase, for example. Let us see what those vulnerabilities are. For us at FDA, one of the big moves that we are making, and we've started to make already, is legitimize the place of this security researcher in the context of the conversation. So not just to be presenting a exploit or a potential for an exploit, I should say, at DEF CON, but bring that researcher to the table as part of a discussion at a professional clinical conference, so that there's a understanding of that there's a unity here of what has to happen. It's not, clearly it's not all about kumbaya, but at the same time, there are pieces of this puzzle that have to be able to work together. And getting through that, there's a cultural shift that is very, very necessary. So it's clearly not about, merely the technology. A lot of it is about the people part.
And then I'll go here.
Yeah, real fast. The researcher is going to be a critical element to answering your question, and it can't be an adversarial relationship. But because this is DC and we have a bunch of policy experts in the room, one of the things that the industry is figuring out is hire the hackers and whatnot. One of the best hackers quit his own company and went into GE to go fix it from within, and we're seeing that trend a lot more. But I want to caution this room: the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, even if a major manufacturer says we will not prosecute you for researching our things, it's still a federal crime in a lot of cases. So there's a lot of debate about changes to those two. And I think we need the cognitive dissonance to resolve the tension between we desperately need an increase in responsible pro bono research from the white hat community because the stakes are getting higher, and we need to increase and modernize those rules so we can have better prosecutions. And I want to make sure that we have to struggle with those choices, because we might find a case where this ecosystem and the FDA needs more participation from our kind, and we have a chilling effect where we're scaring people away from doing so.
So in our report, we did make sure that we talked about things like bug bounty programs, which a lot of companies have done, and say we'll pay you if you find flaws in our products so that we can fix them. And because we found too many headlines as we're going through that of along the lines of hackers can kill rather than
they can save
company
lives.
Makes crappy product with known flaws. Yeah. Ma'am, thanks for your patience.
Sure, no worries. Good morning. My name is Sandra Johnson. I'm with Signal Magazine. For Ms. Schwartz, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't misunderstand a response that you had made to a question. On the issue of whether breaches are to be reported, or you had mentioned that the FDA expects that breaches are reported to you. Is it mandated? And if not, why isn't it mandated? Should it be mandated that on the devices that you do regulate, that breaches are reported to you?
So I want to make the distinction here in terms of breaches that we're not talking about privacy-related breaches, which obviously falls under the domain of a different regulatory authority, really within OCR, within HHS, Office of Civil Rights, I'm sorry, which really regulates all of HIPAA privacy-related. We would not be expecting to receive breaches related to some of the breaches that have occurred in the recent months. If you're talking about an actual exploit that occurred to a medical device, then there is a mechanism by which to report that through our MDR, a medical device reporting system. So it's a passive system, and I will tell you that there is a lot of work going on right now internally in terms of what can we do to get the community to be more active in terms of reporting. Some of it is also the ability to recognize what needs to be reported, and that comes back to the education piece. If one doesn't recognize on the healthcare side that there was an exploit, then how would one be able to even report it? And that's, I think that is a kind of a key principle here that we have.
No silent failure.
Yeah, that's a great no silent failure. So let's tweet that. All right, I'm going to take we're coming down to the last couple minutes. I'm going to take the last 3 questions. So 1 and then 4 questions. I'm going to take the 4 of these. So ma'am, and then John, and then Barry, and then Sean, and then we'll just handle those so that we make sure that we can get through these.
Okay, hi, Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I've been asked to come up with a website to basically educate average people that work 40, 50 hours a week, that need to understand this, to understand the expense and the commitment we need as a country. We have the auto cyber attacks people. A fiction writer was telling me your world, which is the real world, is going to now play with his world, science fiction, because of like the pacemaker with the hacks that can happen. And we don't want that to happen. But when I talk to people about a cyber 9/11, they don't like that because because they believe in Y2K. So to educate people, I'm first finding out where their baseline is, and it's somewhat in the middle. Now, to educate people on this issue, what are your recommendations? You're hiring experts to figure out the problem, but how do we inform America that there really is a problem?
Okay, and then if you can pass it down here to John on the end. Please, go ahead, John. Yeah.
So, Suzanne, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about to what degree you, not coordinate, but to engage with other regulatory stakeholders outside of HHS, like FTC, SEC, FCC, so that there's both a common language and a common understanding of terms like security built from the...
Great question.
Okay, great. And can you pass the microphone up, and we'll get it to the Silver Fox here.
So,
I'm going to take all four of these.
Just very quick, and it might sound philosophical, but looking at the recommendations in the report, which focus a lot on defense and security, the question I had was, is there a role for resilience, especially if you assume that offense is going to continue to be better than defense?
Okay, good. And then Sean.
Thanks. I'm wondering about our lessons learned from other sectors like finance and energy, where it's shown that some degree of division and insulation between the highly permeable corporate networks and the operational networks, be they clearing and trading or pumping and distribution in those two industries. Curious if any of the panelists can comment on the connectivity and security between hospital or healthcare provider corporate networks and the patient outcome related networks. I'm concerned about what is seemingly authorized devices or authorized individuals sending instructions rather than just a completely remote outsider hack.
Okay, I'd like to handle these in these kind of order. Suzanne, you had the most direct to talk about the other regulators. The educating American, talking about the baseline. I mean, Pat, if you can help us on that one. Josh, the other sector's air gap, and I think Pat, you on that one also. And then I think we can kind of finish on resilience because I think it's pretty important. So, Suzanne?
Yeah, to your question. So FDA and now HHS, other entities within HHS, participate in a forum which was established back in June of 2014. That forum is called the Independent and Executive Branch Regulators Forum for Cybersecurity. The forum was really initiated by NRC with a lot of support from the White House, from the National Security Council. The concept of the forum is just that, to bring together all of the regulators who are interested really in participating, both from the executive branch as well as the independent ones, to talk about the particulars that are within each sector. For us, obviously, healthcare and public health, but how we can learn from experiences, occurrences, whether it's in finance, or energy, or the other sectors, and to develop potentially, if not a common framework, but to understand exactly where we are even using the NIST voluntary framework, how we would align with that, how we can take aspects of that and develop almost projects or use cases develop upon that. I will say that FDA's role in that, we have volunteered to take the voluntary aspect of the NIST cybersecurity framework to demonstrate how, utilizing that framework, we are intending to strengthen cybersecurity in the healthcare sector.
Great. And then I think I'll look at the Sean's question on the air gap. You're able to see these things are supposed to be separate, and they end up not be. And I think maybe Josh should kick off on that, and then Pat, if you want to add any color.
So one of the fifth star and the 5-star framework for our cars is segmentation and isolation. So separating critical systems from non-critical systems. I think the financial services sector by far gets this more than any of the others, almost out of necessity for the caliber of adversary they face. The idea here being it's inevitable your car will be hacked. We want that if they hack your radio, they can only change your presets. And at the moment, they can also disable the brakes or turn the steering wheel or deploy the airbag. And I think that's an incredibly good first principle here for medical devices, which is trust zones, segmentation and isolation, both logically and physically. And that's not really a common practice yet. That's one of the areas I think is low-hanging fruit that we can learn from other sectors. Yeah. And to the resilience point, that's also part of survivable design, resilient design, and Carnegie Mellon's got great practice there on combat-ready mission software, but also if you're going to be in a harsher climate, you need more ruggedized things. And tying this all back together, many years back, I wrote something called the Rugged Manifesto, which is essentially a Hippocratic oath, but not for doctors, but for people who write software that can affect public safety.
great.
So I do think one of the steps here is if doctors wake up with that ethic and pathos, perhaps the extension of doctors, which is medical device providers, could also don a first do no harm kind of Hippocratic oath as well.
You know, it's interesting. You talked about the different industries, including oil and gas and so on. And I think the one thing that this report actually calls out is that the healthcare system is not immune. Right, it's just as vulnerable to a lot of the challenges that the other industries have actually had, but I think that the biggest change is that while a provider can actually lock down their data, and certainly they should, and the issues that we've actually we've seen recently, including the one yesterday, should not happen. The challenge that we have right now is the explosion of devices that the consumers actually have that's feeding information into some of those networks, and so that is going to be one of the biggest challenges, is the fact that the number of sensors where data is being gathered, it's very difficult to lock that down. Those devices cannot be contained within four walls. They're everywhere. Yeah. And I think that is a challenge that the industry will have to step up to.
And because it's not like, at least with your computer, you can say, yes, I want to update, please update the software when you get asked, or you've got choices that you can make. If we're talking a lot of these technologies, there really aren't a lot of choices that.
On the other hand, my phone actually updates itself when there's a patch that's available, and so I think that is one of the innovations that we're delivering to the market. Is why even leave that decision in the hands of the users? Because users are lazy and they'll see a patch. I don't have time for this. Just patch it. Don't let the user decide.
Or even be patchable. I mean, some of the things we're talking about here may not even be.
So, to be patchable. So the table stakes are, if you want the benefits of software and connectivity, it comes with the minimum foundational capabilities of noticing and learning from failure, the ability to respond to failure with updates, and the ability to contain and isolate failure. That's the trade.
And okay, and I think I'm gonna draw a line under it there, because I'm sorry we are a little bit over. I want to talk about our next Cyber Risk Wednesday. We're going to move it forward 1 week. It is going to be, I think, on 8th of April, and we're looking at that to look at. Security in the Gulf region, especially we'll know then how the P5+1 talks are going with Iran, and so we want to look at what the threat situation is looking like right now in the Gulf, and particularly with Iran. Also, I want to point out, Mark, if you want to just put your hand up, at the French Embassy on 21 April, they'll have another event on Internet of Things, and so the announcement will be coming out. So if you're interested in IoT as a topic, please keep an eye on the webpage for the French Embassy. Thank you very much for Intel Security for making this happen, and to the panelists, and please join me in giving them some thanks.